Romans 1, 24 to 32. There's no easy way to share this message without compassion and understanding this from God's vantage point. You ever wonder how lesbian, gays, transgenders, homosexuals, pedophiles, people that are totally immoral, how they get that way? They're not born that way. And I know a lot of psychiatrists and people say, well, you were born like that. And that's not true. There's no truth to that. The truth is this, and we're going to find out what God says right here. It's not an easy message. I rarely ever hear any pastor or Bible teacher teach on this session because it's not popular. I was just mentioning, by the way, if you see my mouth crooked, I just came from my last session at the dentist and they shot Novocaine all in there. And I didn't even know it was crooked till I can see my reflection. But and I was sharing a little bit about, I said, look, I got to go do a podcast on Romans 1, and it's not an easy message to do. And she says, and I tried it to tell her, and she says, well, there's no judgment, because that's the trend today, is to be inclusive, all accepting. We're not judging here. That's not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is warn you how people become what they are and what the end result is. My dentist, she's a periodontist. She is really good. And I was asking her, I says, hey, before you start on me, I need to ask you a few questions. She had this thing and she's scraping it, okay? And I said, what's keeping you from slipping and getting my tongue or my gum? She says, well, we hold it like a cue stick with a bridge with our finger so that can't happen. I said, well, good. I'm glad I know that. And I said, I'm also glad to know that you're a good diagnosis, that you really get to the heart of the problem and deal with it. And I said, that's what good Bible study does. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you some really interesting things. Please, look. You don't want to hear about this? Turn me off. I'm sure that there are other preachers that can tickle your ears that you can listen to. I don't have any commission to do that. One of the beautiful things of doing biblical exposition is that you're going from verse 1 to the end. You're following it the way the author wrote it and the way God intends for it to be exposed, okay, shared. What the preacher does is he studies it, he gets insight, he correlates it with all the other basic theologies, and he shares it in what's called a homiletical fashion, a preaching fashion, or in some cases a pedagogical fashion. That's a teaching fashion. By the way, I start next week, and I'm not really going to be teaching in the public school district. I'm going to be more in charter schools. I'm going to be helping to teach young people that are financially and academically handicapped, which is better for me anyway. I would really enjoy doing that. So, but still, it's a heck of a mission field. So be praying about that. Okay, let me read it, and then I'm going to expose it to you. I'll outline it because there's some real interesting things here. Paul has already said, and he says, there's no true atheist. If a person denies God, they got to deny a lot of things to get to that point. They got to deny his evidence that he's put within them of himself, and they got to deny his creation. And it's obvious if anybody has any reason or logical sense, they could look at the world and say, there's an order to this world. Somebody had to order it. There's a beginning to this world. There's a design to this world. So the world points to God and saying, hey, you're the designer, you're the creator, and I'm one of your creations. And that's a beautiful thing, because God not only created his world, which he cares about, which he's going to replace soon, but he's also going to give us a new body. He's given us life at birth. And then when we put our trust in Jesus Christ, he gives us a new birth. And he puts his spirit in us. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that what you have? That's what I have. Okay, so God says, I've made myself known to you, but you have rejected me. You have suppressed the truth. You have pushed me out. You have divorced me. You have removed me from your life. And it says that although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. They became fools because they began to commit idolatry. They worshiped the creation rather than the Creator. And here's the consequence of that. God's going to use 4 words 3 different times. Generally, if you do it twice, there's an emphasis to pay attention. He's going to do it 3 times here in these few short paragraphs. And because they gave up God and they started to worship his creation, and the creation doesn't have to be an object, like a statue or a picture. An idol can be a person. It can be power. It can be prestige. It's whatever you put in the place of God. Well, in this case, they were worshiping God's creation. And some people worship people. That's what happens here. And it says, therefore, this is what happens. When you reject God to that point, you develop what's called a seared conscience, a hardening of the heart. There's a consequence to that. And it says, therefore, God gave them over. And those are the 4 words. God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. He's going to say that 3 times. I know when I was growing up, and I was raised Catholic, so if you did something wrong, you're looking for God to hit you up over the head with a 2x4. Or you're always looking behind your back saying, man, that sin I committed is catching up with me. Excuse me. But that's not what God does. He says, you don't want me in your life? You don't want to acknowledge me as God? Fine. I'll just turn you over. I'm just going to let you go. And he says here, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their heart to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve created things rather than the Creator, who is praised forever. So notice the first thing. He gave them over to sinful desires. But he also gave them over to, in verse 26, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. First, sinful desires, now shameful lust. Now they got this desire. That desire has turned into lust. And lust is not love, because love can't wait to give. Lust can't wait to get. And you've heard plenty of stories of rape, and even in the Bible, where Absalom, David's son, raped his own sister. And David had relations with Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. That's at that stage. Sinful desire eventually turns to shameful lust when God gives you over. And it says this, and here's about lesbians. Even their women exchange natural relations for unnatural women. And there's homosexuals. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. God gave them over to shameful desires, sinful desires, and he gave them over to shameful lusts. Notice the progression. They're going deeper, deeper, and deeper into a pit of immorality. Furthermore, in verse 28, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. See, they knew God. They suppressed it. They put him out. And since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, here we go again. That 4 words. He gave them over to now a depraved mind. So from a sinful desire to shameful lust to now a depraved mind. So you think back over what's gone in the last Biden administration and even before then with them putting the White House in rainbow colors and them advocating for lesbian, gay, transgenders acceptability within society as norm. What they're doing in reality is what God is going to mention here in a second. They are trying to make commonplace that which God has designated here in his word as being perverse. And they didn't think it worthwhile to retain any knowledge of God and suppressed them and put them out of their lives. And it says here, so God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. To do what ought not to be done. Instead of advertising all that, like the White House did, like Biden did, like all his administration did, like many people are still doing today, God is saying that they're doing things that ought not to be done. Even in schools now, in colleges, in churches. Can you believe that? And then he goes on to say, he says, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. So if you look at some of these Hollywood characters that are transgenders or homosexuals or lesbians or bisexuals or whatever, you need to understand how God sees them. Okay? And he sees that they're full with every kind of wickedness, greed, and depravity. I put a picture of one Hollywood gal who was a lady who became a transgender, and look at her picture. In just 3 years of being like that, she went from looking really beautiful to being something really ugly. You know, you look at Ellen DeGeneres and some of these other, one woman that went to Ireland and now she wants to come back. And they are really bad looking. You see a lot of them in this protests and wearing green hair and purple and all that. And you need to understand, no matter how they colored themselves, their heart, as far as God is concerned, is filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. Then he goes on and gives a list. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, rootless. That's a pretty descriptive list of these people here that have suppressed God, that have put God out of the picture, and have worshipped the creation rather than the Creator. What does it do to their hearts? Can you imagine the seared conscience? There's a danger to looking at pornography. There's a danger at worshiping a body. There's a danger to accepting these things that God says are immoral. They don't see that because it's a progression. It's the old, frog in the kettle. You just adjust to this and then you adjust to some of the stuff they have on TV today. You just, when I was younger, there was no way they would have even talked about. And then he goes on to say, he says, and this is what I saw about this last administration. Although they know that God's righteous agrees that those who do such thing deserve death. They know that. They know they're doing wrong. Why do you think they look so ugly and so pruned up all the time? They know that what they're doing is wrong. And it says here, that that those who do such things deserve death. Are you worthy of death? What is Paul doing here? He's building a bridge to what he's going to share even in the next chapter, which is going to blow you away. A lot of people say, hey, yeah, man, he preached it. Yeah, really get down on those people. And Paul's going to turn right around and say, yeah, you know what? You're doing the very thing yourself. And he says, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. If you got an institution, a church, some kind of organization that's gone woke and approve of these things, they need to understand that what they're approving is things, God is saying, those things are worthy of death. And you know that. Why are you promoting them? For a paycheck? To be accepted? So people won't talk about you, so you won't be persecuted? See, it's not about judgment. It's about holding God's standard of morality about what's right and wrong. You know, and so God makes it really clear. They want to make it acceptable, say we were born that way. No, you weren't. You became that way because you pushed God out of the picture and you kept suppressing him and you kept pushing him down and down and down. So God just finally let you go. He turned you over to bad desires, to shameful lusts, and to a depraved mind. You know what a depraved mind's like? You kind of stuff that this guy that went and shot all those kids up in Minnesota, and you read, he hated people, he hated things, he hated himself. He was obsessed with killing children. That's a depraved mind. You want to become like that? Let me tell you something. This is a very serious warning here. So, although we have compassion on people that are struggling with that, now, it's not the same as somebody that has a temptation. A temptation happens to everybody. It's when you give into that, you make it your lifestyle, and you promote it to other people. That's when it's really bad. That's what God's talking about here. Listen, you don't have to be like that. Jesus has made it possible for you to lead that life. And if you would just acknowledge him as your creator, your Lord and your Savior, even right now, he can turn the book around. He can make what is really ugly into something really beautiful. I've seen it. I've heard it. But you got to make that decision. You got to understand it and see it the way God does. Call it as it is. Sin is sin. It's ugly. It's bad. We're all sinners. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. But God's grace makes it possible to be reconciled back to him and to turn the chapter of our lives around. So recognize the truth here, and then we're going to continue on in chapter 2 next time. God bless you all. Have a good day.